So as I stated at the beginning of the symposium, we have two speakers. First speaker was Dr. Steve Chermak and from Michigan State University. Our second speaker is Dr. Ryan Scrivens, also from Michigan State University. And the beauty of both from the same university colleagues is that they've done similar work that interrelates and collaborates on that. And so they teamed up to say, if you do this section, I'll do this section as kind of the follow-on to be able to put that together. And so it'll be kind of the same setup. Dr. Scrivens will be talking about his portion. Again, I encourage the ability to ask those questions during and afterwards on that. And with that, Dr. Scrivens, thank you.
Thanks, everybody, for being here today. I must admit, I'm not going to have the same organized presentation as Dr. Chermak has. And I was teasing Steve on the car ride here, saying I definitely have the more difficult presentation, because what I'm presenting really is research largely on the role of the internet in facilitating violent extremism and terrorism. Just very briefly, my background is in online extremism, online terrorism, with an emphasis on right-wing extremism as well. I've done extensive interviews with law enforcement officials, community activists, current and former right-wing extremists on pathways in and out of violent extremism, the role of the internet in facilitating violent extremism, and ways to think about combating it. But I have a pretty good handle on extremism in general. So as I was putting together this presentation, I was trying to think, well, how am I going to do this? Like, what makes sense? Because we wanted to showcase two of our recent projects, one that I'm leading and one that Steve and colleagues at MSU are leading. So I thought, okay, I don't want to completely bore you guys, so I'll start by giving you kind of a quick and dirty overview of what the empirical literature, so oftentimes data-driven systematic research, tells us about the role of the internet in facilitating violent extremism and terrorism. And second, I was like, okay, this will be a good dovetail into our work. One project is looking at cyber attack strategies by far right, far left, and Islamist extremists. And the second one, looking at extremist posting patterns and behaviors. So there has been an influx of research taking shape, as Steve properly mentioned, on violent extremism and terrorism in general, but in particular, their use of the internet and associated technologies. I don't even know where to start with how this has generated so much buzz, but I'll talk about some of the more recent events. The so-called Islamic State, in their heyday, 2013-14, released a series of beheading videos that circulated online. Right-wing extremist Tarrant live-streamed attack on a New Zealand mosque, I believe it was 2 years ago, as well as announced his intentions online and produced a manifesto online. And more recently, we've seen anarchist networks online play a key role in coordinating nationwide anarchist-inspired violent protests offline, largely around the Black Lives Matter protests. Importantly, though, empirical research has found, like the general population, so I think this is a big misconception, that terrorists and violent extremists are tech-oriented and computer-savvy, but I think most of us in the room are to some extent as well. I think there are some exceptions. Some are more tech-savvy than others. I'll talk about it a little bit later. But I don't think they're that unique from the way that we use the internet and our children use the internet, for example. But it should come as no surprise that they have increased their presence, violent extremists and terrorists, when possible, and we can talk about this more later, in a variety of online settings, ranging from websites to web forums, to blogs, to social media outlets, encrypted platforms, applications, channels, so on and so forth. Here, research suggests that terrorists and violent extremists have exploited the internet and associated technologies due to its ease of use. It's quick and it's cheap, it's unregulated, relatively unregulated, depending on where you live, and relatively secure. Understandably, there have been numerous explanations for why and how terrorists and violent extremists use the internet, dating back from when the internet really started to gain a mainstream use, late 90s, early 2000s. But what I argue here, and how I'm going to try and make sense of the empirical trends in the role of the internet in facilitating violent extremism, is through the work by Conway. She developed what many experts believe is the most well-rounded and most established understanding of core uses of terrorist use of the internet and associated technologies. And when we try to make sense of this, it applies quite nicely to the far left, the far right, and Islamists, and perhaps in some cases, single or secular terrorism or extremism. So the core uses very generally are information provision, networking, recruitment, financing, and information gathering. So the first, research has overwhelmingly found that violent extremists and terrorists have been undeniably quick to adopt and adapt and use every emerging online platform at their disposal to spread propaganda and further their movement's objectives, amongst many other things. Research has also been showing us that the advent of the internet and associated technologies has provided violent extremists and terrorists with a medium with which they can disseminate their rhetoric relatively unimpeded. We can talk about these nuances more later, to a larger audience than ever before the internet was a thing, and through any combination of communication outlets, ranging from spreading hate propaganda using extremist websites to cloaked websites or websites that don't look like extremist websites, to sharing disinformation via video communication to radicalize, mobilize, and strengthen activism, to engaging in cyber fear by uploading manifestos prior to acts of violence. And lastly, to utilize cyberspace as a platform to attack computer systems and spread hate propaganda. Turning now to networking, and it's important to keep in mind that there's a lot of overlap, obviously, between networking and recruitment, but this is just one way to present what the empirical literature tells us about the role of the internet in facilitating violent extremism. But what research shows is that overwhelmingly, violent extremists and terrorists communicate and coordinate through decentralized, all-channel manners online. This allows for linking of subgroups and external organizations from around the world to central online spaces, such as web forums, blogs, and social media sites, quickly and at a low cost. Here, much of the recent focus in the empirical literature has been on examining the link between extremist networking online and their transnational connections, as well as their presence across multiple platforms. Social media companies and law enforcement officials are struggling to kind of play what some call this whack-a-mole game, where people will migrate from platform to platform, or they'll be using multiple platforms. So naturally, research has been moving in this direction. And lastly, this idea around trigger events, some of the work that myself and Steve and others have done, looking at how January 6th, for example, could mobilize extremism online, Trump's election victory, mobilizing online, Black Lives Matter, mobilizing online. Turning 3 to recruitment. So research here has found that to raise awareness and convince individuals to join an extremist movement or group, violent extremists and terrorists use the internet to, 1, increase the possibility of interacting with potential recruits, and 2, research has shown that oftentimes they roam online looking for potential recruits, usually young folks, unfortunately. Research in this space, much of which is typically focused on dedicated extremist sites and web forums, because those are the older spaces and academics tend to work slowly, suggests that extremist recruitment materials include kind of one of two categories. One would be the disturbing text, images, and videos. You can see on the side here the first two are more disturbing than the other one. Some argue that these more kind of over-the-top materials are for the insiders, people who are already in the movement, and it kind of keeps them going. And then we have the more subtle material for outsiders. Some news outlets are questionable at best. They could have extreme right views or extreme left views, but the premise is extremism in some capacity, and this is also used to recruit individuals into violent extremism. But regardless of the recruitment material type, research suggests that violent extremists and terrorists have attempted to recruit via what you guys probably have all seen, and I heard somebody in the audience mentioning this earlier amongst one of their colleagues, eye-catchy and visually appealing content. So this is oftentimes in a multimedia format featuring audio-video files, digital video, interactive chat rooms, bulletin boards, cyber cafes, websites featuring video games, music, tech, dating advice, humor pages, etc., etc., etc. Now, I want to address an elephant in the room. I was trying to think of where I could place this. I've spoken to a couple people about this already. this idea of online radicalization. When we think about radicalization in general, it's a highly contested and contentious term that's obviously received considerable attention in the last 10 or so years. And it's raised a number of theoretical, but perhaps more importantly for the audience today, pragmatic questions, including why do some people transition from a violent ideology, from nonviolent ideology to violent ideology? Importantly, though, pathways of radicalization and associated models are complex. There's no doubt about that. But they have been attributed to several influences ranging from intergroup conflict to religious and political leaders to social networks to family, prison, and something we'll be discussing more after, the internet. Regardless of these kind of complex interactions that occur to push someone from extremist ideology to violent extremism, what's increasingly apparent is that radicalization is multidimensional and cannot be explained via a single factor, whether it's micro, meso, or macro, or a silver bullet explanation. And that obviously makes it a challenge for all the folks in this room, including myself. This is largely because radicalization alone does not necessarily imply action, just as those who act in an extreme manner may not necessarily be radicalized either. And it's just as one example, those who become far-right Christians do not necessarily become radicalized, just as those who engage in fanatical or profound activity may not be radicalized either. Regardless, though, I guess the key takeaway here is that experts generally believe that radicalization is a combination of belief and action. So in other words, like the key component of becoming radicalized is one's willingness to engage in action to maintain a commitment to the cause or the ideology. Radicalization is also theorized as nonlinear process, developing radical views, principles, and ideas, and changing subsequent behavior, whether it's violent or nonviolent, in line with those beliefs. So when we think about the internet now and the role that the internet plays in online radicalization, certainly there's potential for those encountering extremist materials online to be radicalized to violence. What research has shown is that violent radicalization tends to occur gradually. It doesn't have to occur in a linear manner, but it tends to be a gradual process and can begin with the introduction of ideological messages online that are encountered, that then shift them from moderate beliefs to more extreme beliefs. And some work has also shown that repeated exposure to extremist materials online may normalize otherwise fanatical beliefs and lead to unwitting radicalization to violence. But there's a big but here. There's this misconception, and I may be preaching to the choir here, that exposure to extremist content, users, and or networks on the internet automatically results in violent radicalization. It's just not the case. So what I'd argue here is that in understanding the link between violent radicalization and the internet, it's important to note that the internet, or we think about the internet as a facilitative tool that affords greater opportunities for violent radicalization and violent extremism. So some of you are wondering, like, what the hell do you mean by this? Well, breaking down some of the empirical literature on this topic, what it generally suggests that people who become radicalized to violent extremism tend to be first exposed to violent extremist content, networks, individuals, both online and offline. And as I was saying to someone in the audience earlier, it's really, really difficult to disentangle the on and offline worlds. We can get into this more if you'd like after. Some of the research I've done, for example, has shown that exposure to violent extremism mostly commonly occurred after a friend in the offline world who they knew and, more importantly, trusted, directed them to extremist materials online. So nonetheless, if you're going to try to take anything away from this, I'll break it down like this, I guess. So my understanding of online radicalization is, so exposure to extremist content online does play a critical role in sparking people's interest in violent extremist ideologies. However, those susceptible to being recruited into violent extremist groups and movements tend to have a desire to belong to something bigger than themselves, to be part of a collective, for example, which is a key factor that actually sparks that initial interest in violent extremist ideologies. But regardless of however somebody first gets exposed to violent extremist ideologies, groups, movements, so on and so forth, it is the internet that eventually facilitates processes of violent radicalization by essentially enabling people to immerse themselves in extremist content. So together then, what the empirical research, even though it's quite limited, I've been fortunate enough to be working in this empirical side of it. What the research is showing us is that violent radicalization is best conceived as a complex process unfolding both on and offline simultaneously in most cases, I would argue. There's little evidence to suggest that the internet is the sole explanation prompting individuals to decide to engage in violent extremism. Motivation, intent, capacity, and space, amongst other things, must be accounted for. And that's a challenge, I'm sure, for everybody in this room. Okay, now that we've gotten that out of the way, we'll move back to what the empirical research says about the role of the internet in facilitating financing within the terrorism and extremism wheelhouse. So this research space is quite limited, but what it has told us is that due to the immediate interactive and global reach, the internet has greatly increased the potential for violent extremists and terrorists to raise funds for their activities. Of the limited work available, researchers generally suggest that funds are raised via kind of two avenues, the one being merchandise sales via extremist sites. Amazon still has problems with extremist content you can buy on there, as well as donation solicitation. I mean, the convoy generated some funds through crowdfunding, P2P transactions, and cryptocurrencies. But importantly, though, and we don't know a lot about this yet, but what the research has been telling us, I guess I'll say to date, is that such sales and donations made virtually are unlikely to generate a significant amount of funding for groups or movements. They can't generate enough momentum, I would argue, the violent extremist movements online trying to finance. They do, however, enable the spread of their message and serve to keep propaganda available to new recruits, as well as maintain a network of like-minded individuals. So the last one, information gathering. So given that the internet contains an overwhelming amount of information, violent extremists and terrorists, amongst others, that's for sure, can collect intelligence on specific targeting opportunities. They can also learn about anti-terrorism measures. They can share online training materials about how to make homemade bombs, plan assassinations, and how to avoid surveillance, amongst many other things. Notably, the relatively anonymous and private nature of the internet has enabled them to strategize and execute their objective with little risk of being apprehended by law enforcement or perceived legal sanctions. I think that's probably changing, but I think that point still holds true. Regardless, because of the availability of information on the internet, violent extremists and terrorists can open source search for documents for information about potential targets, for example. Anybody really can. Some empirical research, for example, though very limited in the space, has suggested that Google Earth is a useful tool to choose how to plan and how to attack a target. Regardless, and as I've alluded to, very little is empirically known about this, about how violent extremists gather information online. But of the limited work out there, researchers have unpacked how information is gathered via one, information sharing. So it's manuals for making bombs, skilled hackers as well, trying to facilitate discussions online. Some research is starting to emerge on questions around data mining. So information is collected and assembled at scale about specific target opportunities. And there's some work also looking at discussions about targeting critical infrastructure. There are a lot of key gaps in the empirical literature here. The key is to try to find what I think are the most pragmatic and realistic gaps. We know a lot, but we can definitely learn more about radicalization and recruitment on online in general. We don't know a lot about these efforts on fringe or encrypted online platforms for two reasons, I'd argue. One, because they're so new and we just can't work fast enough. But second, it's very difficult to gain access to these moving targets, these different Telegram channels, for example. And second, from a broader scale, we've in terms of thinking about the role of the internet in facilitating violent extremism around financing and information gathering, we know very little at this point. But more importantly, because these are the two papers I'm going to present on now, very little is known about the extent to which terrorists and violent extremists are using cyberspace as a platform to hack and attack online critical infrastructure, i.e. what someone referred to as cyber terrorism. And the second one, very broadly looking at the link between the on and offline worlds of violent extremists. Yeah, sure.
I have a question. You do this research on all of this, the violent extremism and on online stuff. What is the government doing in your research to take care of this? And I get it, it's, cyber crime or whatever, but what are they doing to stop this? I mean, because we do have a lot of domestic terrorism.
Yeah, I guess it just depends on what element we're talking about here. Unfortunately, I don't know what the government is doing in a lot of capacities.
But in your research, you guys don't research any of that to find out?
I don't focus specifically, at least with my current research program, I'm not focusing on what law enforcement are doing in terms of cyber attacks, for example, or posting behaviors. Perhaps that's something, Steve, was that something you're looking at?
I mean, your point is a good one, is that, we're sort of focusing on what's happening online so that we can feed it to law enforcement to sort of change how they do things.
Yeah.
Getting access, I mean, I think still like DHS is in cyber, like the last, in 2020, DHS's emphasis on cyber terrorism. So as they build capacity, I think there'll be more back and forth, between that. But I guess we haven't really studied per se, in terms of strategies that work. Because I think, like Ryan was saying, it was really a moving target. It's a great question, really, in terms
well,
of
because the thing is that it's just so easy to go on the internet and
Absolutely.
look up anything
Yeah.
you want to look up, and who's coming after you? Who's going to be that agency that's going to come after you because you Googled how to build a bomb?
Yeah, I mean, so and it's such a good point. So I do work with law enforcement, and I get wrangled in once in a while to do stuff with big tech. I'll do like an invited talk. I don't want to take their money. But these are some of the issues that they're grappling with, because what they've constantly said to the general public as well as law enforcement researchers, they don't want to be the big brother, right? They don't want to be the ones that are saying what should and should not be online. We're starting to get into blurred territories right now, and something we can talk about a little bit later. But you raise a really good point. So what Steve eloquently put was that the work we're trying to do, especially like I guess because it's the work that I'm looking at specifically around posting behaviors, we're trying to develop these kind of baselines and these behaviors online to then give to law enforcement, and they can try to make sense of them. And our door is always open if they want to come chat with us.
It doesn't seem like it's moving fast enough for us.
It's definitely a challenge. Thanks for your question.
Yeah, no, I just would think too that the big question too is the stuff we talked about with failed and foiled plots earlier. In this space, that's a good study, right? Because we want to know what's working, in that space to sort of say, okay, how did you prevent a cyber terrorism attack, and how do you use that? I think those are good questions.
Manny, you had a question?
Yeah, Ryan, I had a question. Actually, it's for both of you. So when you talk about like social media recruitment, right? And so during attacks on some of the studies that you were looking at, did you guys see a shift or like a dark period where somebody who was online radicalized and then went dark, and then a precipitated event happened, and then an attack occurred? Kind of the question, but did you see a shift when you're talking about strategies from like Facebook or Reddit or whatever these folks are on, and then they shifted operationally to something like more secure platform like WhatsApp or Telegram or Signal? Because even like in March of last year, I think the government exposed some of these media platforms, right? And then Signal and Telegram shot through the roof. Within 1 month, they went from like, I think 200,000 subscribers to several million, because that's a secure platform. And again, it's hard to track because of the evaporative nature of those technologies. So I'm wondering if you guys kind of look at.
I wish we could. The short of it is, I wish we could. I mean, ethically, we're bound by research ethics boards or IRBs at universities, and I don't think they probably wouldn't feel too comfortable with us tracking users across platforms. I think my understanding is one of the best ways to do that is with IP addresses as best as you can, but no research ethics boards will give us that approval. Tech companies are definitely doing that, but we just haven't been, how do I put it? We work in small steps. We're like trying to understand a problem and slowly work our way into other problems, and we haven't gotten to that yet because we don't think we have the capacity to do it in a way that will not only be funded, but get published in a reputable peer-reviewed journal. It's an excellent point, because I mean, that's, something we're seeing a lot more now is not just people migrating from platforms, but people were on these platforms already before. So they're using these platforms all over the place, because there was this assumption that for a while that people were just jumping from platform to platform, but what we're seeing now is people are all over all these platforms.
And it kind of addressed kind of what she was talking about, like you're getting flooded with this stuff, right? From a law enforcement perspective, nationally, right, is that we have agencies, but we're prohibited by Executive Order 1233, which is basically collecting information on U.S. persons. That's the challenge. That's not the challenge in looking at IPs for like overseas entities who are looking at, Times Square, right? We have that ability to do those things, but that's the problem.
And I'll just say this. That's a great point. I'm not coming to the rescue of tech companies by any means, but from my understanding, is their responsibility is if they see violent extremist content or anything that's perceived as a credible threat, they have to immediately hand it over to law enforcement agencies. The extent to which that gets done, I don't know.
Brian, just for everyone's edification, one of the symposiums, or two of the symposiums we look in the future is, one is what I refer to as the British experience, and someone that actually spent their career in law enforcement in British or in Britain, and how they respond to these type of things as well. Second one is what I was referring to, is the Israeli experience as well. Yeah. That were very high levels. How did you respond to these type of things? And the cyber, I will tell you, get back to your question now about, okay, we know this stuff, so who cares, right?
Exactly.
I will tell you that recently, DHS made a large investment in the Center of Excellence just to study cyber attack on that. And it's run under the primary customer CISA for DHS, but they made a big investment to look at these type of things. That was recently awarded, I think, last August.
Was that to you?
You'll see things like
I'll take a question from Brian, and then I'll jump back in.
Content moderation. That's basically the buzzword that Facebook's using to go in and essentially silence certain sources. Have you found that it's skewed the data that you're able to go in and track through the online sourcing?
I'm not looking at it in that capacity as of right now. I'll be completely honest. I focus on certain projects and learn as much about those as I can, and then perhaps I look at something in the future, like content moderation. It's an excellent point. Content moderation it's an interesting one, right? Because it varies by platform, by time, by space, kind of thing. I would assume, and it depends on the platform we're talking about here. If it's Facebook, for example, we're going to see higher levels of moderation than we would on like Reddit, for example. But maybe it's something we can talk about after. It's a great point. It's a great point. So Vic kind of segued me into this idea around cyber attack strategies by far-right, far-left, and Islamist extremists. This is a project led by my colleague Thomas J. Holt, professor in the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State, as well as colleague Dr. Joshua Freilich, professor at John Jay, as well as everybody knows Dr. Cermak. This was a project funded by DHS. I'm going to provide a very high-level overview of this project, and if you have questions that I can't answer, I'll direct them to my colleague. So, as the point I've hopefully made at this, hopefully I've made it pretty clear at this point, is that there's an increase in research on terrorist and violent extremist use of the internet and associated technologies, which is mostly focused on the application of technology for radicalization and recruitment purposes, and to a lesser extent, fundraising and planning purposes. But this work has not been able to address the extent to which ideological actors may engage in targeted attacks against the online infrastructures that support commerce and communications between citizens, industry, and government. And this is in light of research that demonstrates that massive volumes of cyber attacks occur every year, not only in the US, but in various parts of the world, especially the Western world. Cyber attacks have caused substantial economic harms and losses of sensitive data information that affect citizens, corporations, and governments. So in response, Holt and colleagues developed the ECCD, known as the Extremist Cyber Crime Database. It's an open access data set of public information about nation-state and non-nation-state ideologically motivated cyber attacks performed against US targets from 1998 and 2008. And the purpose of creating this database in general is to address gaps in existing research as well as better inform policymakers. I'm not going to get into a lot of details about the inclusion criteria. Steve's done an excellent job of giving an overview of the ECDB, which is very similar to this. So the ECCD was developed by using a definitional framework similar to the ECDB, and with very clear inclusion-exclusion criteria for data. What I will say, in identifying instances, my colleagues searched over 120 separate sources and reviewed them closely to create a list of all known cyber terror attacks that satisfy their inclusion criteria. In terms of the coding, up until this point, they've developed 3 code books to make sense of the materials that they collected, one around the scheme. So they have 53 variables looking at things from the number of entities targeted, successful or unsuccessful, attack methods, ideology, so on and so forth. They've also looked at suspect characteristics, as well as targets of attacks. I'm going to present some preliminary findings. This project is ongoing. I'm not sure if I made a plug before, but it was funded by DHS, and it's continuing to get support from them. What my colleagues have generally found thus far is that extremist cybercrimes vary temporarily and by ideology. If you look on this table here, it's quite clear, for example, that most attacks occurred during the 2010s and accelerated since 2014. But if you look at the total numbers at the bottom, there is some variation in which ideology motivated the attack. And if you look down the column as well, you can look by year and see that there's definitely some variation there. The authors also found that the greatest number of attacks occurred in 2015, and if you look on that table there, it's largely the result of jihadi attacks, reflected by the ISIS's most prolific global growth. I'd argue between 2013 and 2015, they were real powerhouses, unfortunately, both on and offline. These preliminary results seem to reflect that offline trend, for example. Similarly, my colleagues found that far left had extended their engagement in both on and offline spaces, and you can see it in the results there. They had, a steady stream of attacks, if you will, and this reinforces prior predictions by DHS that this ideological movement would expand their activities online. Yeah.
Using the same definition far left is.
This is Steve's.
So, with this not including BLM and Antifa and all that stuff?
It would.
Yes, it would.
It is.
Yeah, it would. Importantly, ideological cyber attacks appear to occur less frequently than traditional economically motivated cyber attacks, such as data breaches for the sake of fraud. But my colleagues would argue that with this increased frequency of ideologically motivated cyber attacks in the last decade, it may be a sign of future threats. As researchers, we don't know a lot about ideologically motivated cyber attacks. That's the reality of it. There really don't seem to be a high number of them, but we can't discard them nonetheless. So that's really what the just is here. My colleagues would argue that we need to keep an eye on this because this is most likely going to be a future thing, if you will. And lastly, The preliminary results seem to suggest that it's unclear why there are distinct differences in the frequency with which attacks occur across extremist ideologies. For instance, what the findings show is that the far left, their activity might reflect differences in operational knowledge and proficiency with technology. There's an argument to be made that people of far left views are probably more technologically sophisticated than people of far right. Jihadists are an interesting one. They have long been recognized to see the importance of engaging in cyber terrorism, though their capacity to effectively attack appears to be inconsistent. And I'd argue it's because there's a lot more focus on their online presence than people with far right or far left views. So I'll make this last point and then jump into my research. One of the next steps for my colleagues is to do qualitative analysis to better understand why and how certain individuals in this data engage in cyber attacks relative to their personal background, including things like their educational level, technological sophistication, and ideological stance. So I'm moving on to the last section here. So as a bit of a caveat, I framed it as examining posting behaviors and patterns of violent and nonviolent right-wing extremists. What I'm looking at here, though, is looking at the extreme or far right, and I'll explain to you why after. I'm leading this project, as well as my colleague Wally Wolasowski, assistant prof at MSU, as well as Josh, Steve, and Richard Frank, who's a computer scientist, a criminologist as well at Simon Fraser University in Canada. So, like most of us, violent extremists and terrorists often leave digital footprints online, including right-wing extremists. As a couple of recent examples, Breivik was a registered member of a white supremacy forum and had ties to far-right social media sites. Dylan Roof allegedly posted messages on an extremist website and hosted his own website containing his own alleged manifesto. And most recently, Tarrant live streamed his attack online as well as announced his intentions and produced a manifesto there. In these cases, as well as jihadi cases, as well as left-wing cases, many researchers, practitioners, and policymakers raise questions about whether such violent individuals can be identified online prior to their attacks offline. But despite these ongoing concerns, one, few empirically grounded analyses have identified which online users have engaged in violent extremism offline and then assessed their digital footprints, and even fewer analyses have identified differences in the posting patterns or behaviors of those who share same or similar extremist ideologies but are violent or nonviolent. So, in other words, or in simple terms, research is overwhelmingly focused on identifying and examining radicals online and not those who adhere to radical beliefs but are violent as well. So what we did for this particular paper, it was last year, it was published in journal Terrorism, Political Violence. If you're interested, I'd be more than willing to share the paper. We've also written what we call like insight blog posts where it gives you a quick and dirty summary of the key findings. For this particular exercise, we examined the posting behavioral patterns of both violent and nonviolent right-wing extremists within a subform of the largest white supremacy forum, Stormfront. Here we investigated if violent right-wing extremists are differentially active online compared to their nonviolent counterpart. And I'm going to answer these questions about why we picked this space, why we picked the extreme right, as I move along through. So, a little bit of background on the data. We examined postings made by the violent and nonviolent group in the open access section of Stormfront. We looked particularly at Stormfront Canada. As you can probably tell by my goofy accent, I'm Canadian. And I'll explain to you why we looked at Stormfront Canada after. But just in general, Stormfront Canada is a subforum or a smaller space within a broader space. It contains largely Canadian-themed content, but it is not restricted to Canadian users only. Stormfront in general is the oldest and largest racial hate site, and it's one of the most active to this date. It is starting to lose some steam and momentum, largely in part to these other platforms and a younger generation of extremists, left, right, moving to Gab and all those other spaces. But today, Stormfront includes over 365 thousand users with over 13.9 million posts. So it's a big platform. And it includes an array of subforums addressing a variety of topics ranging from like culture, politics, ideology. There's like poetry corner, how to save or spend your money, tech talk, so on and so forth. There really are different strokes for different folks in these platforms. But probably most notably is that it has hosted some of the deadliest right-wing extremists since its inception. So it's not just a space where people who are like living in their mom's basement are spewing hatred. There are people in these platforms that have and will engage in violent extremism. So I'm not going to get into too much detail about data collection and sampling. What I will say, though, is that it proceeded in 2 stages. In terms of collecting the data, working with computer scientists, they automatically scrape the data, binned it for us. The subforum at the time that we collected included over 125,000 posts made by approximately 7,000 users between 2001 and 2017. 2017 is just a date that we last collected it on. We could collect it up until today, but we just collected it to that point for this particular exercise. Now, what a lot of you in this room are probably wondering, how can we identify violent and non-violent right-wing extremists? Well, so a former violent extremist who is actively involved in the North American right-wing extremist movement reviewed a list with me, reviewed a list of people who posted in a particular subforum who this individual was actively involved in when he was involved in, was a key player in the right-wing extremist movement in North America, as well as in Canada and the US. So he or she essentially had a pretty good sense, based on his network, who was who in the movement. And what this individual did, after I gave him or her a list, I was watching, he or she picked people who fit violent or non-violent. But each time that the former identified a user of interest, they were asked to explain why, in as much detail as possible. I really went at them, why they were identified as violent or non-violent. And they were asked to provide examples of the activities that each of these identified users engaged in, as well as their association or connection with them. I want to know how they were connected to them. How could they possibly identify this person as someone who engages in physical violence, for example? And this was done in an effort to verify the authenticity, and by extension the data, of each user identified by the former violent right-wing extremist. In total, I got about 30,000 posts. So the former identified 49 violent users and identified 50 non-violent users out of a list of about 7,000 users. And some of you are wondering, well, what's a violent right-wing extremist? So for this particular project, it was those who committed several acts of known physical violence on persons, including violent attacks against minorities and anti-racist groups, both sporadic and planned violence. And those who were non-violent were actively involved in right-wing extremist movement activity offline, such as rallies, protests, gatherings, but did not engage in physical violence on persons in any known capacity to the former extremists. And we can talk about the limitations of this after, I'd be glad to, but I think this is an interesting way to start to gauge posting behaviors based on violent or non-violent. I'm not going to go through the details of the measures, but we had a number of measures that we wanted to test it. We plotted the posting frequency, we did survival analysis, and logistic regression. I'm just going to cut to the chase with the key findings here. So interestingly, the first finding is around this idea of decreased posting behavior. One, we found that there was a general decline in posting behavior over time for all right-wing extremists in the sample, regardless of whether they're violent or not. You can see in this chart, you can see a steady drop there. And we also found that there was a steady dropout in posting frequency for approximately half the sample. Now, a lot of you are wondering, like, who cares? Like, why does this matter? Well, this is noteworthy because it suggests that right-wing extremists in our study, whether violent or non-violent, generally do not increase in posting behavior over time. And again, this is important because it contrasts with some research with kind of frames, including some of my older research, that kind of says, okay, you're going to go in these online spaces and you're going to just become this crazy active poster. You're going to explode. That doesn't seem to be the case in our sample, at least. Our findings tend to align with other empirical work, including some of my more recent stuff, which suggests that the majority of those who post in right-wing extremist online spaces tend to desist in and tail off their posting behavior over time. And our findings may obviously be a symptom of the study sample. Each user that was identified is either violent or non-violent, and they were actively involved in right-wing extremism in some capacity. They were on the streets engaging in something. So it's reasonable to assume then that posting in an open access subforum or space in general may have been a concern to users over time, given that their offline activities. They could have been engaging in violence, illegal activities, organizing rallies, flyering campaigns, so on and so forth. And research on online behaviors of right-wing extremists suggests that those who are actively involved in right-wing extremist activities offline are often concerned that law enforcement officials are monitoring their online activities and may in fact modify their posting behavior to avoid detection. Right-wing extremists in the current study were most likely doing that themselves. They might have been fearful that they're putting themselves in a vulnerable position to then be apprehended by law enforcement. Second key takeaway here is low-profile posting behavior, perhaps maybe the most interesting finding to everybody in the room. So from a policy perspective, our findings suggest that analysts who are searching for signs of violent extremism online should perhaps be less concerned about investigating high-frequency posters and more concerned about those posting fewer messages online. By no means am I saying don't investigate people who are super posters. Focus on the people who aren't posting as much as well. And this is because we found that violent right-wing extremists in our studies tend to be those who are much less active online than their non-violent counterpart. They tend to desist in their posting behavior, so they might be posting a lot at first, but then they slowly stop. And they tend to post just generally less over time. And so research has similarly found that violent right-wing extremists are clandestined, often paranoid because of the violence they engage in, and in turn might be concerned about revealing their identities. And similar to previous research that highlights how some violent extremists alter their online behaviors to avoid detection from law enforcement officials and others, the waning in interactive posting behaviors and patterns that we've identified here might reflect that security concern. I'm going to leave it there, I think, for now. I don't want to go over time unless Vic is willing to give me a couple more minutes. I'm not sure where Vic is. Does anybody have any questions for me right now? Okay.
Your database on this right wing or left wing, did like a law enforcement entity run criminal history to kind of validate the fact that these people had a prior criminal history?
Yeah.
And same thing to your effect, you validate your online extremism, right, and jihadi, that like maybe somebody from the law enforcement will say run your list of folks against NCTC's terrorism database to say that, hey, whatever, 200 of your folks, right, 75% of them showed up in the link to NCTC.
Excellent point. So in our study limitations, we discussed that. No, they haven't. But I think in order to further validate the authenticity of the data and get more of a sense of how violent people were or not violent, we need to be making those connections. We need to be connecting with law enforcement to get a sense of criminal histories. Just because a former extremist was able to identify at a specific period of time that this person did not engage in violence, it tells us the patterns are very interesting, but we're still not getting to some of the key issues that we're interested in. One that we're really interested in, and it's just going to be a challenge to get this data, because getting this data alone is incredibly challenging. We're interested in kind of getting a sense of when people in this sample, for example, when they engaged in violence and what their posting behavior looked like before and after that. You know what I mean? Are there some kind of patterns around that? Are there some kind of ways that we can predict or get insight into what could be future trends, future credible threats? So the purpose of a lot of my recent work is trying to develop frameworks for law enforcement and tech sectors to think about identifying credible threats. It's an incredible challenge to try to identify a needle in a haystack. I didn't have time to present the next paper. This is a paper that just got published. This is a sole author paper from the same data. And what I did was I coded a sample of messages from the non-violent, from the violent, and then for another comparative purposes, just a sample of randomly posted messages from the same space to see what are the differences. I mean, okay, we're seeing some differences between violent and non-violent right-wing extremist posting behaviors online, but is that different to people who post in that same space in general? And I am seeing differences. The non-violents tend to be more ideologically motivated. They post ideologically motivated messages at a higher rate. And I think largely that's because that's what they see their role in as the movement. They see themselves as the ideologues who are providing the conceptual tools to then give to the more violent factions to do what they want with it. I'm finding that the violent are, again, less active in general in posting patterns. But they're not trying to mobilize to violence as much. They're not posting as much ideologically, and they're not posting as much about personal grievances, for example. But there's so much work we can do with this. I mean, half of the last paper, not half, a bigger proportion than what we normally do is on limitations in future research. Because what we're trying to do is try to get people to think about how do you develop these databases? How do we think about these complex problems that just haven't really been able to be addressed before? And we think that this is one way to do it.
I'll just go back to your question. The black hole you mentioned earlier, in between time, I think we can get at that, but we haven't. But getting at, what is your behavior up until right before the event? Were you online or offline? We have anecdotal stuff. Dylan Wolf right up to it, and others right up to when they committed the offense. There is a sort of almost at the same time they're still working it, and so there's not really a black hole. But I think that's an important question. The other question you raised is somewhat problematic only in terms of what our university research boards allow us to do, right? So we get criminal histories from other sources, but I couldn't go and ask somebody to run the names, right? In terms of getting that, and whether or not the same things. It's kind of, it's a different story, but the same problem that I had. I did a gang study in Indianapolis, and we were essentially asking probationers whether you're part of a gang. So we had good data on who were gangs, who were not. And the gang unit in Indianapolis wanted that to compare against theirs, and we got approval to look at the connections, whether or not the people who were saying we were gangs were also on the gang list. And troublesome, their list wasn't very good, at least based on what we had. But a lot of times our review board pushed back on that in terms of doing that. But I think it would be invaluable to think about.
No, and I'm not saying that they would give you the data. I'm just saying to validate, like,
just
to say, like, hey, after your 200 people, 75 were on our radar prior, right?
I
Yeah.
know that. And I think it would be valuable on the law enforcement side.
Definitely.
Again, getting back to that predictive analysis of, like, you have an event, political, whatever, right? Like the McVie thing with Waco, where that was a precipitating event for him. So you go online, you're dark, you come up on these other websites, and then there's a period of inactivity and maybe a political ruling of some sort. And then we have the criminal history, propensity to commit these types of activities, right? And you kind of already winnowed it down between knives and bombings and age group, right, medians.
Yeah, and it's an excellent point, and we'd love to have more granular details on the characteristics making up this sample. I was just lucky to be able to get access to this data. Do you know what I mean? So it started as just a pilot project to generate a conversation, and it's turned into something quite a bit more than that. So I'll be applying for funding to build out this database. So it's good. Thanks for giving us lots to think on. There are some questions over here. If anyone, we'll start with you, please.
Okay, so those that aren't posting as frequently, right? You've noticed kind of like they'll post and then all of a sudden they kind of like stop. Could it be that they are using maybe other platforms because there's, only as us as law enforcement, I know what we've noticed is you have a group, they post, trying to mobilize, and then all of a sudden someone posts, hey, they're on to us, and then it stops. Yeah. Are they using other platforms or other means on social media?
We haven't dug into that question. Anecdotally, I would say so. It seems to be the logical kind of response to that. I would say yes. There's a number of reasons why people could desist in posting. I don't know about you guys, but I mean, I don't blog at all, but I assumed if I did, I might get tired of it after a while and just kind of maybe jump to another platform or just stop altogether. There's a lot of different reasons that we just don't have. But it's a great point. I mean, they could be migrating to other platforms. They could be using other usernames. There's a number of different things there.
I know one of the challenges we face is we do the open source information. Then all of a sudden they set their profile to private,
Yeah.
and we can't get that information.
Yeah, that could be another factor as well. It's an excellent point. Thank you. I saw some other hands up here. Yeah.
So my question was kind of piggybacking off of his as far as like the verification of authenticity. Was it purely based off of word of mouth, or was it also verified through photos or known articulated facts?
It was. I didn't do photos or anything like that because I mean I don't think people want to engage in violence and take photos of it. But what we did. So one thing that I did do is I just probably moved across it so fast, given this talk. I asked what his or her connection was with other people that were identified as violent or nonviolent, and in each case, he or she had a connection. The fact that this individual was only able to basically pick out 99 people out of 7,000 to me kind of says something about their ability to distinguish people. There were other people who could have potentially been in that list, but I didn't feel comfortable with their assessment of them as violent or nonviolent. Future research, in a perfect world, I could be able to interview numerous former violent extremists, but it's just so difficult. It's for anybody working in this space, it's very difficult to get somebody to talk to you in general. It's difficult to get a current or former extremist, current or former violent extremist to talk to you, but then get them to start picking people out of lists who they knew were violent or nonviolent. It's just, it's a headache. But the whole point of this exercise, which I think seems to be working, is just generating this discussion or generating ways for us to think about collecting data or in general making sense of extremist posting behaviors. In this case, looking at the extreme right. So thanks for your question. It's excellent. Yeah.
So I see you guys are collecting a bunch of data, but honestly, like, how do you think it's actually going to help law enforcement? Like, we already know who's doing it. We already know, like, they have to be computer savvy and all these things, but are you, like, coming up with ideas to shoot out to law enforcement, like, hey, when you interview an individual, ask these questions. If you look through their phone, look for these applications, look for these websites. Like, are you guys throwing any of that out there? Because we already know who's doing it. We already know they have to be tech savvy.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So it's like,
No,
why collect more data on something that's already known?
Yeah, no, it's
Why not
excellent.
throw out useful stuff?
No, it's excellent. I think I'll say in my capacity, I have a half-decent sense that that's the work that you're doing. I'm not trying to name names. You know what I mean? I'm trying to just look at large-scale data, for example, and identify patterns that are analyzed in a systematic, meaningful way to then hopefully inform what you guys are doing, who are on the ground, like actually nitty-gritty, have a real sense of who's who, to see if there are posting typologies or profiles that match with what you're seeing, for example. It's a bit of a difficult dance sometimes working with law enforcement. I'm always more than open to do it, but what I do at the very least is I don't just publish peer-reviewed journal articles that unfortunately many times don't get read by practitioners and policymakers. I also publish blog posts in reputable outlets such as the Voxpol Network of Excellence and GNet, which summarizes all of the key findings that is open access for folks like yourself and others to then perhaps make sense of. But I'm always open to collaborate or have discussions. That's why we're here.
And one of the things we're doing now is looking at suspicious activity reports, and whether or not they apply to this kind of sample, cyber samples, compared to other violent extremists, and what's present and what's not. And one of the things we're finding, which is really interesting, is that most of the things that they say you should collect, you just don't have. You don't have that information. You're spending a lot of time looking for things that you're not going to find. But here are the things that you'll find, and this is how to find them. And so those are the kind. So some of our projects, I don't know what, in terms of law enforcement, I think it's maybe interesting, but in terms of actionable, in terms of thinking about policy, but I think both of us, through these discussions, say, well, all right, maybe we need to do a better job in here, and maybe, when we talk about suspicious activities, this is how it really transforms to your work, in terms of where you spend time, and so that's really good feedback.
Manny, I have to cut it short, but I'll be here to chat all day. Sorry. Thanks everybody. I'll be around, and I really appreciate you guys all coming out today. Stay safe. Thanks.